Welcome to day 2 of 4 for our discussion of Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysic. I'll be kind of bringing in some things from Critique of Pure Reason. I think I've mentioned already in this class that he's doing a very similar project. The order of exposition is a little bit different. And we can see it's clustered all around the same time. He wrote the first version of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. Then in 1783 he writes the Prolegomena. And you guys have read the introduction. Have you read the introduction already? If you read the introduction, you'll see that he takes the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics to be a condensed sort of a recap version of what's going on in the Critique of Pure Reason. If you read the two side by side, that might be a little bit surprising, but actually as a kind of an interpretive key, it's really, really helpful. Sometimes it's hard to see how what he's talking about in the Critique of Pure Reason is the same as what's going on in the Prolegomena, but once you recognize that that's what he intends to be doing, suddenly things kind of, they emerge as a little bit clearer. And this is, I think, in large part because Kant writes, and I think demands to be read in such a way that he's kind of, and we'll see this definitely today as I try to explain some concepts, including one key concept, the concept of an intuition. What the heck is an intuition for Kant? That's going to be our big order of business for today is what is an intuition? And we may find, or at least I've found thus far, and I think a lot of other contemporary philosophers have found this as well, and plenty of Kant's contemporaries, which is to say people who were alive when Kant was writing. And those are great folks to go to when you're trying to figure out what did their contemporaries have to say. Those are the people who were reading Kant while Kant was still around, and they could ask him questions and get some feedback on those questions. They understood the context a little better than us. But even them, there are plenty of folks. You could make a big club of people who say, Kant just isn't clear when he talks about what an intuition is. He, never really quite pins it down. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay that he never really gets... He's doing enough. That you might hear me say that a couple of times today. If you're I wish he had done better at explaining what an intuition is. We'd be yeah, me too. But he's first on the scene, and a completely brand new way of thinking, a brand new way of doing metaphysics, and it might not be surprising if not all of his concepts are completely pinned down just yet. You got to leave some work for the next generation of philosophers, after all, right? So wondering about how come we didn't get into more detail about what an intuition is? It's well, this is the book. It's thick enough already. Let somebody else figure out what an intuition is. Yeah, so we'll be frustrated, but we're going to try to have to get as good a picture of what it is as possible. And one of the strategies for this is look at it one way, look at it another way, look at it another way, look at it another way, and try to keep in mind that these are all different perspectives on the same thing, which is kind of what's going on in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Prolegomena. Two different sorts of treatments of the same basic idea. And this idea will represent this big idea that Kant has the same way that I was just talking about. I'll throw a whole bunch of stuff at the board and see what sticks, and we'll try to triangulate it between all of these things. So the first thing that he takes up, and we discussed this at our last meeting, is this question of, is metaphysics possible? David Hume laid out a pretty formidable challenge that seemed to suggest that metaphysics was not possible. And so Kant wants to say, well, is it really possible? This deserves a little bit of a defense. And in fact, maybe the way that he frames this is not really quite, is metaphysics possible? Because that seems like it only invites a yes or no answer. But maybe this question of how could metaphysics be possible? Which seems to maybe suggest a slightly different angle of attack, which is not necessarily just take what metaphysics is, take our concept of possibility, ask does possibility match up with metaphysics, but instead maybe says, is there some way that we need to be re-understanding, rethinking what metaphysics is, such that it might be possible? If we're going to try to figure out, not is metaphysics possible, but maybe what would metaphysics have to be like if it were possible? Because it seems the way that David Hume has described things suggests that it's not possible, and Kant wants to offer some sort of genuine response to what Hume is saying. So we've got that. And it's not just whether or not pure metaphysics is possible. It's not even how would metaphysics be possible? What would metaphysics have to be like in order for it to be possible? But a couple of other things get roped in and come along for the ride. So there's this question of natural science. How would that be possible? How would a pure natural science, and we'll get to what that means maybe towards the end of class when we start talking about pure intuitions. But if there's a pure natural science, how would that be possible? And is natural science the sort of thing that could be grounded? Because again, Hume seemed to suggest that, like, nah, this is just not in the cards for you. Custom and habit, that's as good as we get when it comes to matters of fact. And not just natural science, but also we're going to see mathematics gets roped into things as well. And there's going to be some conversation about pure mathematics, and this is actually part 1 of the Prolegomena. We get an introduction that sketches out what he's up to in the whole thing. Part 1 is all about the possibility of pure mathematics. Part 2 is about the possibility of pure natural science. Part 3 starts to get into whether or not metaphysics is possible, so we're going to kind of be working our way backwards up to metaphysics in our exposition, following the way that Kant does things in the Prolegomena. So just keep in mind here, that question about mathematics, and that marker is done. That question about mathematics is going to be the thing that we're talking about today. And perhaps this isn't so much of a puzzle for those who are kind of coming onto the scene just post-Hume. Hume has given a description of relations between ideas, things that are known a priori and analytically. Analytic knowledge that can be known a priori, and it seems like maybe that's what mathematics is all about, and Kant is perhaps unsurprisingly is going to say, like, not quite. Let's re-understand perhaps what mathematics is up to, and maybe we're going to see that fitting into this sort of picture of mathematics, natural science, and metaphysics in a different way than we're accustomed to. The possible solution that we've already sort of seen the big hint on is metaphysics possible, and Kant's going to be like, yes, I think so, but it's going to be different than we thought. All right, well, how? Well, the answer to that how is going to involve synthetic a priori knowledge. And at this point, I think I've taken multiple classes where we stopped and talked about the analytic, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori distinctions and the way they get paired up. Do I need to do this again? Is there anybody who's still feeling a little bit shaky on this? I don't want to blow a lot of time if nobody's interested, but it's kind of important, so it bears repeating if we still have questions. Corbin? Yeah. Something specific or just like I'm feeling fuzzy?
I guess maybe just a quick recap.
Okay. So Hume gave us that fork that said there's only two things possible. This is relations between ideas and matters of fact. And while he doesn't exactly use this language, once you kind of like get a sense of what it is that Hume is talking about as the difference between relations between ideas and matters of fact, it seems like relations between ideas are analytic knowledge, and it's knowledge that can be known a priori. And matters of fact are synthetic and can be known a posteriori. Only a posteriori. So what do these things mean? Well, keep in mind also that the analytic-synthetic distinction and the a priori, a posteriori distinction, while they seem to be kind of pointing at roughly the same sort of things, such that they pair up the way that Hume or it seems natural to pair them up the way that Hume has suggested, they're getting at slightly different ideas. Analyticity and syntheticity is almost a grammatical idea. It's about whether or not the subject of a statement. And so if I have some knowledge, presumably it's not going to be know-how or some other sort of like species of knowledge. It's going to be propositional knowledge, knowing that something. Being able to tell whether or not a statement is true or false. And all statements have some subject and some predicate to them. So an analytic statement is one where the concept of the predicate is already contained within the concept of the subject. For example, what's the example I've been going to every single time? All bachelors are male. And the concept of bachelor already contains maleness, right? So to be able to determine that this is true, I just need to unpack the concepts that are in the subject. If I understand the concept of the subject, I already know that the predicate maleness is going to attach. These are things that are true by definition, are things that are analytic, statements that are analytic or analytically true. Synthetic statements are ones where, it's not the case that the predicate is already contained in the concept of the subject. Another way that we might think about this is we're joining together sort of like genuinely new concepts. I'm making a statement that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. When Hume talks about analyticity, he says the contradiction of an analytically true statement is self-contradictory. So if instead of all bachelors are male, we were to say something like some bachelors are not male, we'd be saying some unmarried males are not male. And there I just contradicted myself, right? So the contradiction of an analytically true statement is self-contradictory and kind of perhaps even on its surface self-contradictory. The opposite of a synthetically true statement is not necessarily contradictory. It's not the sort of, so for example, if it's like, it's sunny outside today. What if it's not sunny outside? Did I just contradict myself in saying that it's not sunny outside today? No, I didn't. Is today part of the concept of sunny outside? Is sunny outside part of the concept of today? Do these things have to go together? No. So this would be synthetic knowledge. And this is why Hume is suggesting that matters of fact are on this side. And they have to be known through experience. Only after experience could you determine whether or not it's sunny outside today. You can't figure that out just through reflection alone. But you might be able to figure out that all bachelors are male just through reflection alone. You can do analytic statements. You can figure out that analytic statements are true just by analyzing them. That's why they're called analytic, right? So is that good so far, these two pairings? So Kant says they don't have to go together like this. One of the things that we're after here would be statements that are synthetic, which is to say they're not just true by definition. They're not just the unpacking of concepts from one idea to the next. They're not just things that are perhaps not new knowledge, just elaborations on old knowledge. The way that talking about the maleness of bachelors is just elaborating what it means to be a bachelor. We're coming up with things that don't necessarily have to be true. This would be things that are true perhaps about the world. And Kant is saying there might be some of these that we can know a priori without any experience. And if that would be possible, then perhaps metaphysics would be possible. And we talked about this a little bit at our last meeting too. Metaphysics seems to necessarily need to be this sort of body of knowledge. If metaphysics were possible, it would have to be a body of knowledge that admits that of like being known a priori, because it's trying to get beyond experience. It's not the sort of thing that's known through experience. If it was known through experience, it wouldn't be metaphysics. It'd just be physics. It'd just be natural science. It'd be the way that we explore the world with our senses through experience, right? But Kant is saying there's some things that can be known perhaps prior to experience. They're going to be prior to experience, and they're not just going to be true by definition. And this presumably is the sort of thing that the study of metaphysics is after and all about. Did that help at all?
Yes.
Good. Anybody else? Synthetic a priori? This is the golden goose, right? This is the thing that we're after. We're going to get some today. Another way of looking at what Kant's up to in this project is this whole idea of a Copernican revolution. And it's not the literal Copernican revolution. That had already happened quite a bit of time before Kant. That was old news, this shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the solar system. What Kant is up to now is a kind of something as momentous, as earth-shaking as the Copernican revolution, but it has to do with what we think about reality and its relationship to the mind and experiencing subjects. So, yeah, let's go ahead and get this guy on the board. Why not? Instead of a tree, I'm going to do a little daffodil today, because the daffodils are starting to bloom. There we go. So there's our little daffodil. Thanks. I practiced a little bit before class. I was like, I'm going to draw a daffodil. Can I draw a daffodil? And I Googled how to draw a daffodil. And most of it was just like, so draw the daffodil, stupid. That's how. Okay. I'm starting to get a little better at this little Alfred Hitchcock silhouette thing, too. All right, so the way that we had been talking about this was that Kant seems to be following Hume, who never quite put it this way, but when we read Kant's take on Hume, we're kind of like, yeah, that's Hume. He read the same thing that I read, where on this side we've got what Kant refers to as the noumenon, or noumena. And on this side we've got phenomena. Noumena, basically it just means like the objects of experience. We use this phrase too to kind of get at what the noumenon is all about. These are the things in themselves, is the way that Kant refers to it. The objects of experience, or the correlates of experience, that like don't get too attached to that language, because Kant's going to say kind of like, well, like, we don't really want to talk about that. And that's actually his big point, or that's Hume's big point at least, to say that this is off limits, and like you can't really say anything about it except maybe that it's out there. That there is a noumena. There is a noumenal realm. You want to get more specific than that? And things are going to get really, really weird. Because Hume is right. You're trying to reach beyond experience to something behind the experience. And you're going to try to like talk about how that is necessary, how it has to be the case. And like, oh, it doesn't work. It just won't work. This is what section 4 of Hume's inquiry is all about. That's the problem that it raises, is that this is now off limits. And so Kant is saying like, okay, so what then would we be able to do? And Kant says we're going to be able to talk about reality. We're going to be able to talk about objectivity. We're going to be able to do metaphysics. But it's not going to be about things out here. It's going to be about things in here. And before, when I said that like the only thing that you could say about the noumena is that it's out there, even that we're going to realize today is a little bit shaky, because out there is going to get complicated a little bit today. The whole idea of inner and outer. And one of the ways that this kind of like gets broken down is this notion that like, okay, let's blow up what this process that's going on in the mind, and I'll try to repeat as many times as possible that what I'm drawing on the board, and when I describe this as a process that we're viewing from outside, as if it's some sort of like mechanistic, like first in time, this thing happens. And then the next thing that happens in time is this thing happens. And then the next thing that happens in time is this thing. Like it's some Rube Goldberg machine in my mind that like sensation comes in and it gets turned into ideas and thoughts and stuff like that. That's not really quite right. That Kant can't be giving us this depiction, because that would be a view from outside. We'd be talking about phenomena as if it were some noumenon. Right? As if it's the thing in itself. How do minds in themselves actually work? And one of Kant's big points, and this is what's going to create a whole lot of difficulty and what requires a sort of Copernican revolution in thought, is that you're always on the inside of phenomena. You can't take a view of anything except from the inside of phenomena. So there is no, like, even from the kind of way that we're talking about, like, all right, so the noumena is out there, and inside the phenomena, first this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Well, Kant says the only way that we can even talk about this, the only way that we have any access to what's going on in here at all, is not going to be from the outside. It's going to be from the inside. And sometimes we're going to have to work backwards. We're going to have to start with what's present to our mind and try to strip things away. And the process, the kind of big sketch of what's going on here in the Kantian project, or what Kant says is going on in our mind in his projects, is that we start with intuitions. And intuitions get organized by concepts. And only after intuitions can get organized by concepts is it possible that we have any experience. And the big trick in all of this, and when I say trick, that makes it sound like it's cheap, maybe a little bit, like it's not cheap. The big conceptual move, or the kind of like the logical sort of thing, the thing that Kant is doing, and it looks like his thumb is detached, but you see it from the other side, and it's like, not really, is that if experience is down here, everything upstream in this process is prior to experience. And prior to is going to be weird too, just like outside and inside is going to be weird, as we're going to see today, because before and after is going to get really complicated. But insofar as these things are what we might refer to as necessary conditions for experience, they're going to be a priori. They're going to be things that have to be prior to experience, because you can't have any experience without them. So therefore, they must be prior to experience. And if that stuff is also synthetic, then we've got our synthetic a priori. And we're going to get some, or at least what Kant claims to be some, today. One more thing I want to get on the board in terms of kind of triangulating what it is that Kant is up to here, and that is this phrase. Right. I totally forgot at the beginning of class to mention, I don't know if you noticed, Exam 1 has been posted. Have you noticed that Exam 1 has been posted? You have a week to do Exam 1 starting today. It's due midnight 1 week from today. It's got 3 sections to it. The first section's relatively easy. The second section's a little bit harder, but not much. The third section's a little tougher. And in the third section, you have 7 possible essay topics. You only have to pick the 2 that you like the most. Maybe don't even think about it in terms of the ones you like the most. The ones that you think you're going to get the best grade on. Maybe I'll let you determine your own strategy for picking questions to answer on this exam. But there are a couple of questions on Kant, and one of them is about this. So I'm going to kind of play a little bit coy with explaining this one because it's an exam question. It's that Kant refers to himself as an empirical realist. Did I mention this at all last meeting? No, okay. He refers to himself as an empirical realist and a transcendental idealist. And it's incredibly unlikely that I'm going to explain what this means in today's meeting. In fact, it's almost impossible for me to explain what that is all about in today's meeting. Maybe at the next meeting, and maybe I'll just keep it to myself to let you work it out on the exam. But this refers to this kind of ambiguous question for Kant. And I think most of these questions are ambiguous for Kant. He manages to find himself in the middle of lots of debates, or presumably maybe solving some debates. This has to do with where Kant sits with respect to this debate between rationalism and empiricism. The rationalists think that some sorts of knowledge are obtainable a priori, are obtainable without recourse to experience whatsoever. And the empiricists say, well, there is no knowledge except knowledge that's grounded in empirical experience, in the sorts of experiences that you have through the senses. And these two groups seem to be opposed to one another. We've been kind of sketching out a loose opposition throughout the history of early modernity, starting with Descartes, who seems pretty clearly a rationalist, getting all the way to Hume, who seems pretty clearly an empiricist, and a skeptical empiricist at that. In fact, this was your last reflection draft, right? Is Hume's an empiricist, and he also is a skeptic. If anybody's an empiricist, do they have to follow Hume to skepticism? So Kant says he's an empirical realist and a transcendental idealist. What does that mean? I ain't going to tell you today, but keep all of these things in mind. Try to juggle them. They're all balls that need to stay in the air. And what Kant is up to is some sort of, it's all of those things at once. That gets us, I think, more or less to where we're going to start today. Any questions about this so far? This is recap, with the exception of that last piece, which is new. Nope. Okay. Here we go. Intuitions. Intuitions. What's an intuition? Short answer, I don't know. Longer answer, Corbin, you want to take a stab that's slightly better than IDK?
I had one question
Okay.
for you.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Does Kant's rejection of Lumina necessarily make him an idealist?
Does it necessarily make him an idealist? It makes him a very specific kind of idealist. It makes him a transcendental idealist. Yeah. Yeah, that was easy. All right. What does that mean? I'm not going to say today. Maybe not ever. Okay. Intuitions. What are these things? Did this kind of work well? When I was just let's throw a whole bunch of stuff? A couple of people weakly nodding. Let's do it again. I'll just throw a whole bunch of stuff. And I'll say every single one of these is going to be kinda, sorta, maybe, mostly, or at least a little bit what an intuition is. Where we started with this, I think, at our last meeting, where I was like, well, what are intuitions all about? I said, well, think of them, at least in a first draft sort of way, as Humean sense impressions. Especially with respect to this notion that Hume has kind of brought onto the scene, that's a slight difference from Locke, that sense impressions are not yet ideas. Sense impressions have to be copied in order to be ideas. And Kant's going to say it's more complicated than just copying a sense impression. You have to be able to start making some sense out of an idea. But Humean sense impressions is kind of sort of what an intuition is all about. We can think of some other sorts of approaches to this as well. We might take, this is kind of sort of similar. If you want to try to read Kant against Aristotle, you can kind of find some similarities or some common ground between Kantian intuitions and Aristotelian treatments of this term nous, which is kind of like, if you want to make ancient philosophy really complicated, you can say, like, well, what do people think that nous is all about? And one of the things that Aristotle says about nous, and that's a complicated enough concept on its own that's maybe not going to clear up Kantian intuitions at all, but one of the things that Aristotle says about nous is it's an immediate sort of grasping of things with the mind. When I say immediate, I don't mean it happens really fast. I mean it's not mediated by anything. It's a direct sort of a grasping. And I'm not sure how great an example this is, but like for example, let's take something like this. Do you see it? Do you see this blue marker? I gave it away. It's a blue marker. When you see this, and you see it as a blue marker, do you just grasp it immediately as like, boom, blue marker? Or do you say like, well, it's blue here, or it's like this shade of blue here, and then it's a slightly darker blue on this kind of like shadowy side, and then there's like a glare on this spot, and then it's white. Like, are you piecing all of this stuff together and then inferring from that, like, therefore it's a blue marker? Or are you just like, boom, blue marker? The second one, just boom, blue marker. If you did just grasp it immediately as blue marker, and I'm not sure that we do, I think maybe we kind of, behind the scenes, we're piecing stuff together, and that's a big part of what Kant is trying to explain. But if you were to immediately grasp something at all, the way that we seem to be able to just boom, like boom, noosed it, blue marker, that's what we mean by an immediate grasping. This is to be contrasted with the way that Kant is going to talk about this. He's going to say that this is, and intuitions are, this is non-discursive. And that starts to get into territory that we're really not going to address today, but we're going to get at our next meeting. But when we say non-discursive, it means that appearances aren't being brought underneath concepts. They're not being organized by concepts. They're not bringing the appearances of sensation into conversation with concepts to try to figure out, like, how do I take this? Because that's sort of like one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that anybody just immediately grasps blue marker, is that we have a concept of blue and a concept of marker, and it's only after subsuming the appearance of this thing underneath those two concepts that we can take it as a blue marker. So that seems like it's a sort of a discursive knowledge, and Kant is going to say, like, yeah, but not intuitions. Intuitions are non-discursive. Concepts haven't even come on the scene yet, and that's why this has to be an immediate grasping. Yes? Where does Aristotle talk about nous? You can find him talking about nous in at least a little bit in Book 3 of On the Soul, and I think in more detail in a slightly different context in what I think is Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's the book where he talks about intellectual virtues. He shifts over from conversation about moral virtues to conversation about intellectual virtues, and one of the intellectual virtues, or one of the faculties of the mind that he discusses, is nous. There are others, like techne, which is a kind of a technical know-how. It's how to like get from how to get to an end through some certain means. There's Sophia, which is wisdom. There's episteme, which is kind of like scientific knowledge, and he discusses all of those. So nous, maybe, or Aristotelian nous, gets a little bit at what Kant is talking about, especially this notion that it's an immediate sort of a grasping, and the way that Kant's going to say that is it's non-discursive. Kind of piggybacking on this a little bit, we might say it's how we grasp particular or individual things. And even that's like, take that with a grain of salt. I'm not sure how true that's going to be for Kant, but it's getting close. When I say it's how we grasp particular things, think back to, like, what is this again? Blue marker? If this is a blue marker, it's not just grasped as a particular thing. It's grasped as a blue marker, as if there are many blue markers and this is just one token of a type. Right? To see this as a blue marker is not to take it as an individual. It's to take it as a member of a class, the class of all blue things that are also markers. So to grasp something as an individual is just to say, like, I don't know what it is. It's just a thing. And as we'll see, even thing is going to be like a little bit complicated. Thing might be a concept already. Yeah. What's that? The concepts are the classes. Yeah. Yeah. And I can think of a concept as basically it's just a class of things. It's a box. Things either go in it or they go out it. Is it blue or is it not blue? It's blue. All right. It's in the blue box. Is it a marker or is it not a marker? It's a marker. All right, it's in the marker box. It's in both the blue and the marker box. It's a blue marker. Right? So maybe we're thinking about it's how we grasp things in their particularity, not as they relate to some class of things or to a concept, right? And this is kind of, we can see how these are going to maybe play well together, that it's non-discursive or that it's immediate. This is why it's how we grasp particular things. What else can we say about this? Oh, yeah, Kant makes a big fuss over how intuition is the receptive. And maybe we might call it passive, although I'll put that in scare quotes because I'm not really feeling great about calling it passive, but it's the receptive or passive aspect of experience. There are going to be parts of experience that are active. These kind of like the organizational process that's going to happen later. But intuition seems to be something that's passively received, or at least it's received. I get it from the world. I don't make it. Which brings up kind of like another way of thinking about this. We might think about intuition as it's kind of like the fuel, or maybe it's the material for thought. Or it's the fuel or it's the material for experience or for mental activity. Your mind works on stuff, but it doesn't work on anything unless you give it something to work on. And the things that we give our minds to work on are intuitions. Which maybe kind of, I think, gets us to something else. Kant says this in the Critique of Pure Reason. There's a relatively famous phrase. Can I erase this? I might have to draw it again. Not the flower? All right, I'll erase this part because that's not even what we're talking about today. That's going to happen later, right? Kant says the following, and I'll put it in a different color. He says, thoughts without content are empty, and intuitions without concepts are blind. He says that in the Critique of Pure Reason, I want to say A51, I think that's B75. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. A51, B75 or 76. In case anybody's looking stuff up. Try to cite my sources a little bit better. Maybe you guys will learn how to cite your sources better in your writing if I demonstrate it a little more. So yeah, thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind, which I think maybe sums up kind of what's going on here. Thinking needs some sort of material. If you don't give it something to work on, it's just empty thought. It's not a real thing. It's not a genuine thought. And intuitions without concepts, well, we don't really know exactly what we're talking about just yet. And this is maybe, I think, one of the crucial aspects of intuition that's really, really difficult to wrap your head around because it never gets brought to your understanding. We're talking about intuition, and this is all prior to even having had an experience. The aspects of your mind where you really grasp and understand things isn't even on the scene yet. This is just raw sensibility. This is just the appearances as they present themselves to you. And you never actually seem to have any direct access to that because it seems like all of your experiences presuppose that some work has already been done on them, right? So what are the intuitions like? And we've talked about this a little bit before. We've talked about this in terms of sense data that I haven't begun to organize yet that's just noise. I can't even pick things out of it yet. It's just the fire hose of experience. I think the phrase that I used at our last meeting was one that William James uses, talking about the blooming, buzzing confusion. raw sensory experience, or of appearances as they present themselves to me before I've begun to make any sense of them. So that's what intuitions are. Kinda. Or it's a bunch of things that intuitions are like. And I'm content, I think, for now to at least kind of step back and say, any questions? Keeping in mind that I might say, yeah, I'm not going to answer that question right now. But I might answer that question. Yeah, Corbin.
So intuitions are always in some way disconnected from any capacity for understanding that we have.
Oh, they're intimately connected to it. Because they're a necessary condition for it. You can't have thoughts without content are empty. The content is being provided by intuition, right? So it's totally connected to experience, but it's just what I get in experience is not the intuition. It's the intuition that's been worked on already by my mind, by the more active aspects of my mind.
Is that any different than how Hume kind of ended his inquiry to human understanding and saying that like nature gives us knowledge, but we can never quite uphold that?
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, I think it's quite close to what Hume says in his inquiry, and this is perhaps not surprising because Kant is following Hume quite closely, with the exception of the thing that's going to come next. That's going to be the sort of thing that David Hume would have been like, I can't believe you did that. Maybe he would have agreed, maybe he would have disagreed, but it's going to be very, very different from David Hume. But yeah, more or less. Yeah, Charles.
Kind of claiming then that like if somebody had no senses,
Yes.
Like they were blind, they were deaf, they had no sense of touch, like anything, they didn't even know the outside world existed.
Yeah.
So would they not
like brain in a vat, right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Would they then not be able to have intuitions, and would they then not be able to have experiences?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. It seems like the Kantian would be on the hook there to either say, then intuition is coming in some other way besides the senses, or, yes, somebody with no body could have no experiences. So this kind of like shuts down conversations about like, could you just be a brain and could you be a mind without a body? This is the way that Descartes put it, right? Could your mind be separable from your body? Either as an immaterial soul or maybe as like, well, it's the part of the body but just none of the sensory apparatus of the body. It's just the brain in a vat, thinking thoughts. And not like a brain harvested from somebody who's already had experiences, a brand new brain, a newborn's brain. In fact, maybe it's had some experiences in the womb, perhaps. So like get it as early, grow it from scratch in the vat, and don't ever let any kind of like sights or sounds or smells or touches or tastes in, then yeah, it seems like Kant would say, well then thoughts without content are empty. Like it can't think, it has nothing to think with.
I wonder if then it could play on the, like you said, in the vat. I was thinking about like the water, like it could feel the temperature of the water, like possibly the brain itself could actually like pinpoint something from the.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the brain to know whether it like can tell whether its surroundings are warm or cold. I know that sometimes my head feels hot or cold, but I think that's the skin, not my brain. Does anybody know more about this? Obviously, lots of people know more about this than I do. Does anybody in the room know more about this?
They work on your brain and brain surgery while you're gone.
Yeah, I think you have no sensory nerve endings. I don't know how true that is, like across the brain, but I do know, yeah, you can do certain kinds of brain surgery on people while they're awake with nothing but a local anesthetic on the skin. And in fact, it's the only way to do certain kinds of surgeries where you're wondering, like, I don't want to just like take memories out of this person as I cut on their brain. I want them to like stay more or less intact. So we'll cut a little bit and we'll say like, all right, so say something, and the person goes like, blah, 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 and we're like, okay, that was the language center. Like back up a little bit. All right. Okay. How are we feeling about these intuitions? Like, have some kind of intuition, what intuition might be? You feel like maybe you're kind of circling in on it? Yeah. It's okay to feel a little bit disappointed. I think this is one of the weakest places in this work, is trying to explain what an intuition is. But, that said, that's not much of a criticism because, for one, he did enough already. Let's not fault him for not doing more. And secondly, it's really hard, and it seems in principle really hard to pin this down, because we're trying to get back to a stage of like what's happening in your mind before you have even begun to make sense of sensation. Like the way, just saying it right there is almost a little bit peculiar, right? Because to sense something, it seems like I've already begun to make sense of it, and it's like no. There's a stage of sensation before you've made sense of it, and that's what intuition is, or at least that's what empirical intuition is.
So
Yeah.
isn't like intuitions and concepts are a necessary condition?
Yeah, intuitions and concepts are both necessary conditions for experience, which means that in intuition and in concepts, we're going to find some likely candidates for things that we know that they're going to be a priori. They're definitely going to be prior to experience insofar as they're necessary conditions for it. And if we can find things that are synthetically known there, then we're doing metaphysics. Yes?
Could you explain, I guess you already have it, maybe in more detail about some examples Kant gives with intuition?
I can't really, because they're not differentiable from one another. Like I can't say you've never had an experience of intuition alone. Because in order to have an experience, the intuitions have to have been organized by concepts, right? Intuitions without concepts are blind. So yeah, no, I can't really give you an example or anything that you can kind of like find an experience that is an intuition. But perhaps maybe we can know that like there has to be something. Before I've begun to like make sense of sensation, before I've begun to make sense of appearances and think of them as an appearance of something as some certain way, there has to be some kind of like raw material first. And does that seem plausible enough? He's not just like telling a story and you're like, that's one way to tell a story, Kant. Kant is saying like, this is the only way for this to happen. You cannot have experience unless some kind of raw material comes to your mind first. And who knows how it gets in? Maybe it's through touch. Maybe it's through smell. Maybe God lightning bolts the knowledge directly into your brain. Well, not directly into your brain, but like first in a form that's intuited, and then it gets organized by concepts, and you're like, what was that? It was the voice of God. And you're like, well, you don't hear the voice of God with your ears. I don't think so. Do you?
Not my experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never heard these things, so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I've heard Whitney Houston. I heard the voice of God with my ears. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, not like Moses heard the voice of God. I don't know if he heard it with his ears. Maybe that went, or maybe like the evil deceiver, Descartes' evil deceiver, is going directly into, but not direct. Like there's got to be some sort of immediate introduction of whatever that is. This is what Princess Elizabeth was getting at. Like there's got to be some kind of explanation of how things get caused in the mind, how things go from outside of the mind to inside of the mind. And if the mind is a completely different kind of substance than body is, then that's a really, really big causal problem for how it is that sense experience becomes mental ideas. So Kant is saying, like, okay, first it comes in as intuition, and that's just the fire hose. That's just the raw feed. Nobody's made any sense of it yet. You can't say it's a blue marker. You can't say it's a red tablet case. You might not even really be able to say it's a thing over there. It's just something's happening. And that's intuition. Perhaps paradoxically, we might be able to make a little bit more sense out of a particular kind of intuition. And maybe this is kind of what you were asking after here, Corbin. And I probably should have just said, yes, I can give you an example. I'm going to give you an example of two very specific kinds of intuitions, and they're very special intuitions. In fact, they're different than all of the other intuitions because they're what are known as pure intuitions. Pure as opposed to versus empirical. Intuitions. And all of the rest of like sense experience and the appearances that I get from my senses, those are empirical intuitions. That's that raw feed of sensation. But pure intuitions are a little bit different. In order to kind of start to make sense of what those are like, we got to understand what it is that Kant means when he says pure. And anytime he uses this term pure, and it's not just for intuitions, we're going to see he's going to talk about pure concepts of the understanding, and he's going to be talking about like all other sorts of activities of the mind in their pure forms. Every time he says this word pure, Kant means there is no empirical content. So a pure intuition would be an intuition with no empirical content. All of the sensory aspects of the intuition will not be there. They have been stripped out. I say this and I look around the room to see like if anybody's face looks like they ate a bug, because like if I were in your situation right now, I'd be thinking to myself like, what the fuck is he talking about? Like, how could there be a pure intuition? We just said that Humean sense impressions was like a good start for thinking about what an intuition is, and Humean sense impressions are just the sense data. I've been talking this whole time about like intuitions. They're kind of like, they're the raw sense data. Okay, so think about the raw sense data with all of the sensory aspects removed, no empirical content. That's nothing, right? Is there anything left at all when you've stripped out all of the empirical content out of some sort of intuition? Is there anything left at all? You see me, right? You have a sight? You have a sight with sounds over time? Okay. Take all the sights out. Just kind of imaginatively like strip that out. All of the colors, remove those. All of the shapes, remove those. All of the sounds, they're gone too. Are you thinking thoughts? Yeah, get rid of those. Completely empty. What are you left with? Are you left with nothing? Black's a color, so strip that guy out too. So not even black. And like, what does it sound like? It sounds like static. Yeah, get rid of that. It's like none of that. Is anything left? There are two things that are left. Are two pure intuitions. Intuitions with no empirical content, and they are very, very special. Have you done the reading? Two pure intuitions. Space and time. Anybody who's like, yeah, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say space and time. Yeah, Charles?
If I put a brain in a vat, is it ever going to have an idea of space?
Maybe and maybe not. And this starts to get into this question about like to what extent would we say that Kant is an empiricist? Because if we're going to say something like, the brain has to have some sort of sense experience in order to even have pure intuitions of space and time, then we might kind of lean towards interpreting Kant as more or less the same as most empiricists, which is to say some sort of empirical experience needs to happen in order for any sort of ideas to happen at all, and that means all ideas are based on empirical sense experience. But it's not entirely clear where Kant is going to go on this, whether space and time would be there before. I think he might say, like, you have to start with having had some experience and then start stripping the things out. And this is maybe one of the places where I think some folks might get a little bit itchy about calling this a priori knowledge, the sort of knowledge that I had an empirical experience, or I had some kind of experience, and then I said, all right, so strip away all of the concepts. What am I left with? I'm left with empirical intuition. Okay, strip away all of the empirical content from that. Now what am I left with? And Kant says, you're not left with nothing. You're left with empty space and time. And these things must have been prior to experience. But it seems almost, as Charles is pointing out, that like I don't even really get on the trail of these things. Like I start by having experience, and then I start wondering, like, how is experience possible? And then I work backwards to the necessary conditions for experience. And this is perhaps why Kant plays a little bit loose with this the a prioriness of the a priori knowledge that we're getting here. Is that like, well, it kind of seems like maybe we had to have had some experience to begin thinking about what the necessary conditions for that experience were. But if we don't think that that's a problem, and I think it's not necessarily a problem, it's not clear that it's really a problem for Kant. Mostly because the whole prior part of a priori just got really weird because time apparently is a pure intuition. So the whole idea of like before and after, that's all wrapped up here. And for that matter, inside and outside is going to be all wrapped up in here. The way that he talks about space, he says the pure intuition pertaining to, or the pure intuition, sometimes he might refer to this as the form of, all outer sense, which would make time the pure intuition pertaining to and the form of not outer sense, but inner sense. Yeah, you got it. Of inner sense. And we've seen that distinction before. Some form of it, at least, already. We saw it as far back as Locke, right? Locke made a difference between like reflection and sensation. And Hume followed on that maybe a little bit in his distinction between impressions and ideas. All right. So we have a pure intuition of inner sense and a pure intuition or the form of outer sense. First of all, before we start kind of cashing out what all this means, did the route that we got to it through, did that make sense? Was there some kind of intuitive, that's not the word I want to use. Was there kind of some sort of gut level resonance when I said, if you strip out all of the empirical content, you're not left with nothing in intuition. You're left with empty space and empty time. Can you imagine empty space? Like I was asking you before, like strip all the things out and some people close their eyes. Can you imagine empty space? No? Maybe that's harder than it seems. I think maybe I could imagine empty space. Can you imagine time passing but no events happening? This is maybe what empty time is. Can you imagine no time? Or no space? Not empty space, but no space at all. Not empty time, but no time. If you can't, if even after you've stripped out everything else, space and time are left hanging out there all empty and alone, waiting to be filled up with things, then maybe there's something to what Kant is saying here. Yeah, Corinne.
I feel like time is secondary to space, though, because if you're floating in space, then you have no concept of time. But
if you're floating in space, you have no concept of time?
Yeah, like for example, like if somebody's in like a cave or something
Sure.
for months, and they can't see anything, all they have is where to feel around. I think that's happened to somebody before, and it turned out they were there for like months, but it only felt like days.
So they might have trouble measuring time. But I don't know if I would go so far as to say they lose all sense of time. Because I bet you that person, even no matter how dark it got, how lonely they got, and how crazy they started to go, they could probably still count. They probably still understood the difference between before and after. Since we're talking about inner sense, by the way, here, like recognize that like your thoughts present themselves to you in a well-ordered sequence of before and after, right? You have one idea, and then after that, you have another idea. And then after that, you have another idea. And they're all kind of lined up in this kind of before and after and before and after and after and after and after and after. This is time, right? It's the ordering of things into before and after in a well-ordered sequence. And insofar as this is how your inner sense like presents ideas to you, like one at a time in sequence, this is time. Space is... And again, like you can be bad at gauging spaces. Like how far is that? Is that 100 meters, 150 meters? I don't know. I'm not really good at that sort of thing. But can you do like in front of, behind, to the right of, to the left of, above, below, further, closer, inner, outer? These are all like basic spatial concepts. And it seems like we're not necessarily talking about like marking this off and measuring stuff just yet. But this is to say, when I say that space is the form of all outer sense, we're noting that all outer sense comes in space. It happens in some sort of, like, there's a to the right of and to the left of in all outer sense. There's closer and farther in all outer sense. At the very least, insofar as we're talking about there's outer sense, if I recognize it as outer sense, already spatial, because outer and inner are already spatial ideas as well. And all of my inner sense, all of my mental activity gets presented to me in this well-ordered sequence, which is time. That's the form of time, the before and after of a well-ordered sequence. Yeah, Will.
So I'm not a general science major, but isn't there like a relationship between like time and space? Like, just like if you're moving like very quickly, then time as something weird. Something.
Yeah, if you're very, very heavy or you're moving very quickly, yeah, approaching the speed of light, then
totally
you might.
Things?
Then time and the experience of time and space, that's not to say that like things go out of order when you start approaching the speed of light, but time appears to slow down, not to you, but you compared to some other observer in a different inertial frame of reference. So at the same time might be complicated. This is what Einstein has to say. But that doesn't seem to like threaten what's going on. Like time may seem to pass more slowly for you than for somebody else. But that doesn't stop it from being a well-ordered sequence of before and after.
Like I was thinking like if there was like some sort of like relationship
Yeah.
between them.
Also, yeah, so there might be, and there might be here as well. It seems like there would have to be. Inner sense, I said like outer sense is already spatial. So is inner already spatial. When I talk about a before and after sequence, did you think of this? Because that's spatial. I don't know about you. I think about like time sometimes in a spatial metaphor, right? I make a timeline, and the before is always on the left, and the after is always on the right. So these things definitely like shuffle back and forth from one another, between one another. There seems to be some sort of relationship between them, but I like your question for another reason, in that it kind of suggests maybe we were talking about space and time just now as like, are space and time out here? Are space and time like things in themselves? Maybe. Maybe space and time are things in themselves, but not when Kant talks about them, because he doesn't talk about the things in themselves, because he read David Hume. David Hume said, don't talk about things in themselves. And Kant was like, why? And then he read it and he was like, oh, I get why. Yeah, because they're off limits, because you can't touch them. You can't say anything about them sensibly. Maybe the things in themselves, maybe the noumenal world is also spatially ordered and temporally ordered. Maybe it's not. What I do know is that my mind is. As intuitions come in, the first thing that happens to them is they get organized according to space and time. And even if it was the case that space and time were real things in themselves, and we're like, that's where the spatial organization happens. It happens out here, not in here. And we'd be like, the mind would still have to be receptive to that organization. The mind would still have to be able to take spatially arranged things and represent them to itself in a spatially arranged way. Or it's going to have to do that in time as well. Time might be an actual thing out there, and it might correspond to the passage of time in one's mind. But in order for that to happen, this pure intuition of time has to be at work in the mind as well. So these things, just like everything that Kant talks about, these are on the side of phenomena. These are two very important aspects of intuitions. We have our pure intuitions. Space and time. That regardless of whether space and time are out here, they're going to have to be here. Does that make sense? Poor Jack. I think it just killed him. Yeah, Corbin.
Could space be understood as a capacity of nothingness, where something can enter into nothing?
I'm sure it could be thought of as that, but Kant's not thinking of it as nothingness. It's the something that's left when you strip all the empirical content out of outer sense. Yeah. So like to the right of, to the left of, I don't know if that's nothingness. You can have empty space. But you don't have to have empty space. In fact, space is more interesting when it's not empty. If space is the form of outer sense, then we have to kind of like give something. If you were in empty space, if you were a brain in a vat in empty space, I don't know that you would say like, oh, there's space. It's not like there's a grid just kind of like really out there, right? That says, like kind of tracks how far away from the point of origin you are on the x-axis or the y-axis or the z-axis. That's an invention. So maybe there's actual space out there, but it's not nothingness, though. It's a way of organizing empirical content when empirical content comes through it. It's the first filter of not really making sense of things just yet, but making them the sorts of things that could be made sense of. Kant talks about these pure intuitions as These make appearances determinable. It's to say, not yet determinate. I haven't actually started to make sense of them yet, but they're only the kinds of things that I could make sense of because they get organized according to space and time first. I'm not going to be able to say, like, oh, there's a blue marker, if I can't arrange this spatially first. Like all of the empirical intuitions, all of the sensory content that's coming at me, if it doesn't get organized by space and time, then it's not even going to be the sort of thing that I can begin to make sense of with concepts. This step has to happen. And when it happens, I still don't yet have experience. I haven't even gotten to that operation of concepts on intuition. This is like the first thing that happens, and it happens within intuition. It has to. Otherwise, what intuition gives to our mind wouldn't be the sort of thing that could be made sense of at all. Will?
So this might just be evidence of like me not being able, or us not being able to like understand space or time without the other one. But if I personally cannot understand how space could be without time or vice versa, so doesn't that kind of suggest that like they're not necessarily like different things? Because I don't understand how you could have space but not have time, because without time you could move through the space, or the space couldn't be in the. Does that make sense?
What about just like a snapshot of space in a moment of time?
But there's time. That's the moment of time that is in.
Yeah, well, no, but time is this well-ordered sequence of before and after. If I just take a slice of it, it's not really time, is it?
If you take a picture of it, that's not really space. It's a picture of space.
Yeah, okay. Maybe. Well, I think the picture would still be spatial, right? It would have a top and a bottom and a left and a right.
Right, but you would have also. But however real that space is in that picture, I feel like the time is also that real.
Oh, don't think it. You're thinking about it like it's over here.
Well, but if you're taking a picture of space,
Yeah.
then you took a picture of space, and that is showing you space in the picture. But isn't it showing you space in the picture at that time?
Yeah. So that's how you can think of that's how you can think of space without time. It's space in just a moment of time, and it never moves on from that moment to another. Like nothing ever changes. And you're like, what was it like before that? And I'm like, there is no before that. There's no before and after. There's just an eternal now. And if you took ancient philosophy, which you did, then I can say, like, go read Parmenides' Periphuseos. He'll give you a picture of, like, no space and no time, right? An eternal now and eternal here that, like, never changes or anything like that. Yeah, and Kant's going to say, like, maybe, and I don't even know why I'm putting up a fight on this. I don't know that Kant is saying, like, no, you can think about space as separate from time. Like, maybe, maybe not. Maybe he's named two things that are two sides of the same coin. Either way, it seems like something like this has to happen at the level of intuition. Otherwise, we don't even move on to the next step, and experiences can't happen. Yes, Charles?
I feel like usually it would be simpler to try and say that time is an extrapolation of order. Are we rather saying that we can have the idea of order because we have a pure intuition of time?
Both space and time are ways of making order, right? So not just time. The ordering for time is before and after. The ordering for space is a little more complicated. It's in front of, behind. Yeah.
We're saying it's a pure intuition, though, so that means if time were just an extrapolation of the order of things, that would need to have things to order. So without things.
Yeah. So we might be back to like we might be talking about thoughts without content or empty, right? If we're talking about like just empty space, nothing in the space. Kant is identifying this as like a conceptual possibility, but it's not like you can have that experience. It's not like you can just shut your eyes and shut your ears and like stop thinking thoughts, and then you would experience just empty space and time. I think Kant would be of the opinion that like, no, you only ever really get space and time with things in them. And this is actually how we know that there are space and time, because everything always comes. All outer sense always comes in space. All inner sense always comes in time. These are things that have to have been there already. They are necessary conditions for experience. So they are, if I don't know if anybody's keeping track of this, synthetic a priori, boys and girls. Might set this up for the remainder of our 2 meetings after this. Every time you see a synthetic a priori, be like, ooh, synthetic a priori. Like these, space and time, are things that, nobody said experience has to be spatial. Nobody says experience has to, well, Kant just said experience has to be spatial and temporal, but it's not in the definition of experience. It's not analytic. It's not that space and time are already contained within the concept of experience. But they do seem necessary, and they do seem like they have to be there in order for experience to be possible at all. So they're a priori. They're both synthetic and a priori. Boom. Space and we just did some metaphysics right there. We talked about the nature of space and time. And again, space and time are not things, or they may or may not be things that are out here in the noumenal world, and they might be things in themselves. But even if they were, they would have to be pure intuitions as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to experience the spatially organized world as spatially organized unless I had that apparatus already in my mind. One more thing about this. And this is what the actual heading in the Prolegomena for this first section is all about. He doesn't say, let's talk about intuitions. Although in the Critique of Pure Reason, the section on this is it's not about let's talk about intuitions, or at least that's not the title. It's called the Transcendental Aesthetic. And aesthetic there is not about beauty. It's not gonna what makes things artistic or something like that. It's not that kind of aesthetics. It's coming from the Greek word aesthesis. Kind of like phenomena comes from the Greek word phainai, which means appearances. Aesthesis also means kind of sensory appearances. So the transcendental aesthetic is all about what can we figure out about this step of mental activity that we call sensation. And it's a peculiar sort of mental activity because it's a sort of receptivity. It's a passive activity. It's the way in which I receive either external or even internal material for my mind to work on. And it turns out that space and time are the pure intuitions at the bottom of all of this. All outer sense is going to come in space. All inner sense is going to come ordered in time. So that's what's going on in the Critique of Pure Reason in the Transcendental Aesthetic. Section 1 of the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics is about not intuitions, not the Transcendental Aesthetic. It's about whether or not pure mathematics is possible. And I mentioned, I circled it over there in blue. Mathematics. This comes roaring back into all of this. So, this is what makes pure mathematics possible. There's such a thing as applied mathematics, where I take actual empirical experiences and I apply mathematical concepts to them. I might say something like, I want to plant a vegetable garden in my backyard, so I'm going to rope off certain sorts of portions of it, and I'm going to maybe do a little bit of math on a sheet of paper. That would be applied mathematics, perhaps. But there's such a thing as pure mathematics, which according to what we said purity was for Kant, it's going to be mathematics with no empirical content, which is actually most of the mathematics that you've ever done in any math class. Did you guys have this experience when you were younger, taking math class? Maybe even having it now, where maybe not something this simple, but your teacher says 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you're yeah, but 2 whats? What are the things that we're talking about in mathematics? And if you ask a mathematician this, they might give a variety of answers. They might say, I'm talking about any possible things. 2 anythings and 2 anythings are going to be 4 things. So maybe this is about everything. Maybe it's about nothing, or it's about nothing in particular. Yeah. Well, not 2 nothings, but 2, 2 whats? And you're I'm not talking about 2 anythings. It's just 2. What is 2? What is the number? What is mathematics all about? And is there such a thing as pure mathematics? And if you went to the math department and said, is there such a thing as pure mathematics, mathematics that has no empirical content whatsoever, you might get a bunch of folks that would be yeah, totally, we do that. But Kant has given us a very different way of thinking about how this is going to work. Most people think that pure mathematics is possible because it's analytic. Mathematics is just a formal system, and all you're doing is describing relations between ideas. Kant takes a bit of a stand on this and says, no. These two synthetic a priori things that we just found. And by the way, when I'm talking about space and time here, I'm not talking about a concept of space or a concept of time. That's going to come later. We just got a concept of space as the pure intuition pertaining to, or the form of all outer sense. That's not what's here. The pure intuition isn't this idea. This idea is a concept. That's like way later in the chain. That's when we're doing metaphysics. So this is at work, and discovering that it's at work is doing a little bit of metaphysics. I got lost. Yeah, pure mathematics. So how is that going to be possible, and is it related to this? And Kant says, absolutely it's related to this. Space follows the rules of mathematics. There's a whole branch of mathematics that's all about exploring the rules that space follows. You know what it's called? It's called geometry. And there's a whole branch of mathematics that's just about the well-ordered succession of maybe not before and after, but the way that you can name all of the befores and afters in a well-ordered succession. I mentioned it earlier when Corinne was asking about this, and I said counting. Counting is just marking off time. And I don't even have to make sure that exactly one hippopotamus passes between each number. I just need to say 1, 2, 3. The only thing about counting that needs to happen is that all the numbers have to come in the right order, right? And so that's all that number is. It's just an ordering of succession of earlier and later, with the bigger numbers coming later and the earlier numbers coming earlier, or the smaller numbers coming earlier. And this is the mathematical discipline of arithmetic. And it was obvious to everybody, including Immanuel Kant in the 1780s, because Descartes had been on the scene for at least 100 years, that you could very easily shuttle back and forth between geometry and arithmetic. This is Descartes' big mathematical invention. It was analytic geometry. It was a way to go from numbers to shapes back and forth really, really easily with this kind of Cartesian coordinate plane system thing. But these are nothing more than just exploring the rules of space and time. And if you wanted a little bit of kind of extra assurance that space and time are necessary, that every experiencing subject must get their intuitions first and foremost as made determinable through the pure intuitions of space and time, you can just reflect on the fact that mathematics works for everybody. We don't disagree about mathematics. Kant has given us a picture of mathematics where it's just the rules of space and time, and where space and time aren't necessarily things in themselves. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but we don't talk about that stuff. Space and times are the aspects of receptivity through which any intuition could be the sort of thing that could be made sense of at all. And because they're necessary conditions for all possible experience, everybody's mathematics is going to be the same. If anybody were ever to say to you something like, isn't it amazing that math works all the time? A Kantian response to them would be, no shit, mathematics makes sense all the time, because all of the things that come into my mind come through the rules of mathematics first and foremost. They come through space and time. And just cashing out what how those things have to work is what pure mathematics is all about. You can do empirical mathematics, where you use those concepts on sensory information. But you can also do pure mathematics. And contrary to folks like almost anybody else but Kant, who are going to say that mathematics is analytic, Kant is going to say, no, because it's based on all of this, it's synthetic. Maybe there are aspects of doing mathematics that are analytic once we get all of our axioms in place. It's just analysis after that. There's a whole branch of mathematics called mathematical analysis, but it's not all mathematics. So he thinks of mathematics, or pure mathematics at least, as another example of synthetic a priori, and that's going to give him a kind of a stepping stone up to natural science and eventually to metaphysics as well. So we got some synthetic a priori. We got space and time, which are cool. A very weird version of space and time. And we have maybe some sense of what happens at the level of intuition. Our next meeting is going to get into all right, so those intuitions need to be discursively organized according to concepts. And that apparently is going to make natural science possible. and we'll get into what those pure concepts might be. If you have any questions, feel free to hang around after. I'll talk to you. Otherwise, see you on Thursday.